This is the first of what I hope would be a series on the Bible. Why do that? Because the Bible comes up in a lot of other discussions, and most of the time when I hear people talk about the Bible in other places, I cringe not because they believe something different than I do about it, but because the conclusions they draw are based upon, let's say, inadequate information. And a lot of the problem that people don't understand about ancient text in general is that they have lost a lot of context along the way. Even if they're copied perfectly, there's a lot that isn't said, just as you would write a letter to somebody today and you have shared knowledge and will refer to things without the need to explain them. And so it's true with the Bible as well. And so what we need to do is try to gather as much information as we can to reconstruct the context. And this has to start with the text itself, making sure you have the right words. And that's not as easy as it sounds, but it's also, on the other hand, not as impossible as it sounds. There are techniques by which scholars of any quality and reputation will approach any ancient text, and there are methods by which these texts are reconstructed or analyzed and dated. And the texts aren't dated necessarily by the material they're written on, but also the style of writing, because the farther back you go in time, the fewer people actually wrote, and so you're going to have less variation in the written form of the language. But today, people, when they argue over the meaning of various parts of the Bible, they typically base these arguments on translations. But even when they do go to the original languages, the ones they think are original aren't necessarily so, at least in that form. And so any theories that are based upon the forms of letters, for example, or the number of letters, are already on shaky ground because we do not have the originals. So what I'm hoping to do is, at least in this video, is to try to present a brief bit of evidence and information that will throw light upon the ancient manuscripts and languages of the Bible. And also I will talk about the importance of having a good source for anything you might want to look up about the languages, because they're not all equal. Understand, of course, also that this kind of a study does not undermine the integrity of the Bible. The fact that we know there is tampering, and that it proves that it's discoverable, that we can discover the truth and get to the originals to a degree of probability that would be acceptable, because nothing can really be totally proven. Excuse me. So we're always dealing with probabilities, but I think we will find at the end of all the studies that the Bible holds up very well as an ancient document, and we can have very good confidence in it. Alright, let's start with what I have here on the screen, Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. People don't know there is such a thing as Paleo-Hebrew. They think that the letters we have, that we see now, that's typically recognized as Hebrew, is what we've always had, but that's not true. You can see here, this is the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, which is a variation or a variant of the Phoenician alphabet. It contains 22 letters, which are all consonants, and what they're saying is described as an abjad. It's just a made-up term that means a language with no vowels. Not that the language has no vowels, but in the written form they only write the consonants. There is archaeological evidence of the use of the script by the Israelites for writing Hebrew language to around, this is about 1,000 years before Christ. So it's had been around for quite a while, and then by about 500 years later it started to fall into disuse, and they adapted the Aramaic alphabet, which is the form of the letters that we recognize today. And we can scroll down here and see that the Here's the Phoenician letters, and here's Paleo-Hebrew, practically identical. Here's basically the Aramaic, or current Hebrew, and you can see there's a very big leap between Paleo and Aramaic. So we have to understand that the original Bible was not written in the square Hebrew script that we recognize today. Also, just as a side note, you can see that it says where this language fits in a timeline of sorts. And the parent systems are the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the Proto-Sinaitic, and that a child system would be one that came after it, the Samaritan alphabet, which they say in the article is more like the Paleo-Hebrew than the Aramaic. So, but none of these had vowels in them, and that makes a big difference later on. What we're going to see is that when this fell out of use, and for a while, first they switched to an Assyrian script during what is called the Babylonian exile, which was about 609 to 538 BC. And what that means is that the people of Israel were exiled by God, who used another nation, Babylon, to take the people of Israel to Babylon and replace the land of Israel with Babylonians. That's what they did in those days. If you conquered a country, you replaced the indigenous population. And they used an Assyrian script. And then they went to the Aramaic around the 3rd century. You can read more about the Babylonian captivity here. Yes, I'm using Wikipedia, but it's handy. It gets the basics, and that's all we need. We're not going into a deep study here. So that's about the time that happened, and so a lot of other changes happened during that time as well. Then, also about that time, there became into use a Greek translation around the 3rd century BC during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals. And this is the Bible that was used in the 1st century because, the time of Christ. And this is the Bible that Jesus and the apostles all quoted from. It's the Greek version, not a Hebrew version. And this is why sometimes a lot of times when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, it's not exactly the same. It's because we're dealing with a Greek translation that they were using as opposed to a later Hebrew version. We'll talk more about that next. So that's why there are differences in those quotes. So this page here that you can see is Septuagint.net. Tell you all about that translation and its influences on Christianity. One of the things that happened, after the time of Christ is the Christians were using the Septuagint to prove that Jesus had fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah. And of course, the rabbis and scribes and all did not like that one bit. So they, at first, made a Greek translation of their own that downplayed messianic prophecies. Yes, they would and did monkey with the Bible. I wish I could find an old video I saw of a modern-day Pharisee giving a lecture where he explained that the attitude of the Jewish scribes and Pharisees and rabbis was that if God gave them something, whether it's the law or anything else that came from God, then it was theirs, and not even God could tell them what to do with it after that. Okay? Which is kind of a big deal, because people assume that the Jews, with their careful copying and all that, would never do such a thing. But yes, they would, and they did. I mean, they killed their own Messiah. What else would they do? So, we have to understand what was going on, what was happening to the Old Testament during this time of transition. Now, during about the 10th or 11th centuries AD, which there was a group of people called the Masoretes. They used to be called Talmudists, and if you are familiar at all with some of these terms, the Talmud is a collection of rabbinical teachings and interpretations and a lot of misogyny and other bad things that arose during the Babylonian captivity. And out of this group, I guess somewhere along the line they changed their name to Masoretes. So when you hear about the Masoretic text, which almost all modern Bibles, including even back to the King James and a little bit before, all use this Masoretic text for their Old Testament. And that's a problem. It is a contrived and assembled text that is not entirely accurate, and deliberately not accurate, because, as I said, they wanted to hide messianic prophecies. That's why you get, for example, the big controversy over whether a passage in Isaiah, I think it is, that predicts the Messiah, says that he would be born of a virgin, the Septuagint says, but the Masoretic text says young woman. It's an ambiguous term that they use instead of one that's more specific, and there's a reason for that. They wanted to hide the fact that Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies. So if they couldn't change the fact of what Jesus did, they would change the predictions. They went back and altered history. So even though we have a discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that put back the evidence for the Hebrew text a few centuries earlier, it really didn't touch on or correct in any way these changes. They had happened before that. And another thing to understand is when the Masoretes assembled this version, they added what is called vowel pointing. Since there are no vowels in the language in written form, they added these little dots and things on the top and bottoms of letters and various parts of the word to tell you how to pronounce it. But how you pronounce it can radically alter the meaning. And you can get here's a whole page on the Masoretic text. Anything else, details you want to read about it. And down here is where you can see that they talked about the Greek word parthenos, which is version, and they use alma in Hebrew, which is young girl. So also at the end of this time, all other Hebrew manuscripts except for the Masoretic text disappeared. Well, gosh, why did they disappear? It was deliberate. They were destroyed, as it says here, by the same people who had gathered them up, the Talmudic Masoretic Jews. Then the Jews began presenting themselves as diligent preservers of the Hebrew Bible and began deceiving Christians. They no longer blatantly attacked the Septuagint, but rather touted themselves as being faithful servants of God. To this end, when the Masoretic text was finished, they counted every letter and word and contrived mechanisms to ensure that the manuscripts would be faithfully transmitted, but they did not bother to account for the editing and corruption that they themselves had been doing for the previous 600 to 700 years. The English translations of the Bible were based on the Latin Vulgate, but the Jews intended to deceive the Christians into translating their Bibles from the Hebrew Masoretic text, so their new strategy was to win over the stupid Christians, but the old motives were always there. So here we have the motive for altering the text, and it's pretty indisputable in my opinion, other research that I've done. So knowing that the Hebrew version is corrupted in certain places for certain reasons, then you have to question any teaching or belief that stems from analysis of the letters themselves, such as gematria. Any kind of code system is going to be suspect because of that. Because even though they carefully counted all these things, who is to say they didn't put messages in there? So you can't trust it, is what I'm saying. But monkeying with the Bible didn't stop there. There's an article here that quotes another article and just summarizes the main part I wanted to look at, where there was a question about a certain prophecy in the Bible about whether it referred to Russia or whether it referred to a name or a title, basically, is the disagreement. And there was a section here, reasons Rosh refers to Russia. Yeah, alliteration with R there. We see here that a whole page of notes of research by this guy. I guess you pronounce it Genesius, something like that. A page of notes does not appear in any of the English translations of his lexicon. Those who disagree with him have failed to refute his sizable body of convincing evidence identifying Rosh with Russia. So here we see once again that simply by omitting research, people could change the meaning of the text by saying, well, this we know from antiquity referred to such and such, when in fact they left out a lot of evidence that says something else. So sneaky tampering, which, as any strategist would tell you, is much more effective. It's like a half-truth, like I mentioned in another video. You don't make a direct assault. You infiltrate, you distract, whatever you have to do to get people to swallow a lie. Now let's move on to another more modern issue of tampering. And this one is, as you can see here, is from a site called God's Word to Women. This was by a series of lessons in the 1800s by a lady named Catherine Bushnell. She was a medical doctor, a missionary, a linguist, and she ran by all her linguistic questions to various scholars of her day who would critique them. And so each of these paragraphs is numbered because they were originally individual lessons that were posted in a publication and were assembled later by someone else into a book. But anyway, I want to call particular attention to lesson number 621, 622. And I'm just going to read this real quick because it shows another way in which this vowel pointing and the bias of the Jewish scribes has had a wide-ranging detrimental effect upon Christian belief. Excuse me. And I quote 621, I think we find another case of prejudiced translation in Isaiah 3:12. The word translated children in this verse in Isaiah is a plural masculine participle of the verb to glean, abuse, practice. It is translated glean in Leviticus 19:10, etc., etc. The word has no translation such as children anywhere else in the Bible, and it occurs 21 times. Another word altogether is used for children and child in verses 4 and 5 of the same chapter. The sense seems to have been fixed by the supposed context to correspond with women. As to the word translated women, two words without the rabbinical vowel points are exactly alike. One is pronounced nashim, or nashim probably, and the other nashim. In appearance, the only difference is a slight mark under the first letter of the Hebrew word nashim. The first word means exactors. The one with a vowel mark under the initial letter means women. The entire decision, therefore, as to whether the word means one or the other depends on option, and that's her emphasis. Those who pointed the word, that is, to put the vowel points, evidently thought the nation could sink no lower than to pass under women rulers, and then translated the word children to match it. Commentators frequently call attention to the alternate reading. See Adam Clark on the passage. The Septuagint, as I mentioned earlier, translates, as for my people, tax gatherers, and there's the Greek word pactores, tax gatherers glean them, and exactors rule over them. And she goes on in 622, there seems little in the context to support the translation children and women, but study the context as regards to the other reading. After complaining of the gleaners, that is, tax gatherers, and extortioners, they are threatened in the following language. Quote, the Lord standeth up to plead and standeth up to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and the princes, and she has some parentheses here, rulers, masculine, not feminine gender, thereof, for you have eaten up the vineyard, which is the conduct of extortionate tax gatherers, and the spoil of the poor is in your houses. That is to say, you stole it. You robbed the poor. What mean ye that ye crush my people and grind the faces of the poor? So in other words, God is blasting these people for, like tax gatherers and gleaners, just mowing down the poor and taking all their stuff and storing it in their house. So it has nothing to do with women and children or of having a woman leader as a shame of a nation. And you don't know how much damage has been done by people taking the verse as the misogynistic Jews translated it and running with it. Just to finish up what Bushnell says, because of this context, we believe that option took the wrong turn when it decided to translate this verse as it stands in our English version, and that this translation would have had a strong showing up of its sophistries, which is trickery, had educated women been on the last revision committee. So and then there's an important statement at the end here. These instances are trivial when taken one by one, but many straws floating in one direction prove that the current runs that way strongly. So here we have a very sneaky thing done only by pointing a word's vowels, which to them probably technically got them off the hook of changing the Word of God, although they certainly did change it. They didn't violate the letter of the law. They violated the spirit of the law. But this was very sneaky, and as I said, the implications, the aftermath of this kind of what she calls sophistry is just without measure, because so many lives have been damaged because of that. Now I want to look at source material for a little bit here. Here we see a discussion of a popular resource called Strong's Concordance. And it explains what it is and what's wrong with it, as people use it a lot of times to prove the meaning of a Greek word, and they should not. It was never meant to do that. The Strong's Concordance is a helpful tool, I'm reading here, that lists every Hebrew and Greek lemma, which is a root word, presented in the King James Bible. Only that translation, and how it used the word. Along with listing these, it goes on to say, the tool also generally gives a gloss for each word. Now we click on gloss, we can find out that that is just a brief notation. It is not a full semantic range of a word. And it doesn't even, as far as I know, give any what's called attestation. It doesn't give antiquity, evidence from antiquity that supports or justifies the meaning that they're giving it. You're just supposed to accept it. Along with these glosses, it may also include a lexicon, but the tool itself is popular because it's free. And he goes on to say the differences between those things. A lexicon, which is basically a full-blown dictionary, a scholarly dictionary, gives an inventory of all the lexemes, remember that's the root words, in a given language. So in other words, it's not based on a translation, it's based on the language itself. Gives an inventory of all the lexemes in a given language. Strong's Concordance is based only on a specific English translation, the KJV, King James Version. And while Strong's, if skipping down here, while Strong's gives a gloss for each lemma, this is not the main purpose of this tool, and as such should not be used as a lexicon nor as a dictionary. A collection of glosses is rightly called a glossary. That's where that word comes from. A glossary is just a very quick description of how a word is being used in a particular document. And in this case, the particular document is a translation, not the original biblical languages. So here, then he gives reasons why it is problematic to use Strong's as a lexicon. One is ambiguity. Consider the following sentence. She is looking for a match. Is the subject trying to light a candle or find a romantic partner? The gloss definition here is ambiguous and gives us no help in disambiguating, which means clarifying, the meaning in this context. And it says grammatical features should be examined, such as the parsing, which means to break it down into its linguistic components and see how it fits with other words, which Strong's Concordance offers no help with. The other caution is nuances of meaning. Sometimes there's more than one meaning listed for a term. It offers no help when determining which, if any, gloss is most appropriate in context. So here again, Strong's is not concerned with context. Often, knowledge of the original languages is required to determine what grammatical and contextual features are present in order to determine the correct gloss, if any. Also, authors can use the same word differently in differing contexts, such as James and Paul's usage of the word faith. So, his conclusion, therefore claiming the meaning of a specific word in a given context is X on the basis of Strong's Concordance is not a reliable claim. And I don't know how many people I've come across who, thump Strong's Concordance as saying this is the end-all be-all of biblical meaning, and, ordinary peon me cannot dispute it. This is entirely false, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. I think it's helpful to give an example of what Strong's gets wrong. There's this word toxon. That's the transliteration. That means you take equivalent letters from one language to another without any regard for meaning. You just transpose the letters, just like we saw earlier with the Paleo-Hebrew was changed through the years, and at first they just took for the modern Hebrew alphabet, which is Aramaic, they just ported the sounds of the letters over and made new shapes for them. And Strong's, the best quality of Strong's Concordance is that it gives a number to every root word, and this is handy for identifying a root, and I'll give them that was a very good feature to have. Then look at this, frequency in the New Testament, 1. And if I can pronounce it right, this is what is called a hapax legomenon, something like that, which means it happens once. It's a word that you only see once, and those are problematic because you only have one context. Whereas in other writings you may find out it means other things. And so in this case, when we have a single occurring word in the New Testament, we have to look elsewhere to find out its semantic range. Otherwise, it's just circular reasoning. You apply a meaning that you think it means in that context and then say that's authoritative and put that in your concordance. But even Strong says, and this part of it is right, and I'll let me go on then. It says it's a bow, a weapon. Here's the single occurrence, Revelation 6:2. The rider on the white horse, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, rider has a bow. Okay? What is the bow? Well, many believe that it means like an aura or a rainbow or a fake rainbow, because this is depicting the Antichrist at that point. Here's the verse. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and the one seated on it had a bow, toxon. Accusative singular neuter is the parsing I talked about. It just means where it is in the sentence, how many things, and the grammatical gender, which has nothing to do with biological gender, which is a whole different issue. And there was given to him a crown, and that word they don't tell you here is, there's 2 different words for crown in the Greek. One is Stephanos, which this one is here, and it's the crown of a victor. The other is diadem, which is the crown of royalty. This one has a victor's crown, and he went out to conquering and to conquer. So we have this kind of crown used for this kind of activity. Now, what makes us think that this bow is not also having to do with conquering? In the context here, even with Strong's and everything, we have a very strong contextual cue that this bow is a weapon and not an article of clothing or something surrounding the person. And just because they have the bow, normally in Greek, if you're surrounded by something, even the Greek's words for clothing have to do with wrapping something around you. And that's a different word. Now, where does anyone get the idea that this is a piece of cloth? Well, they get it from, let me get the next page here. You look up and this was a different Strong's page. Here is, let me go down here, Bible Hub's version of that Strong's entry. It says bow, and then it says, if you go down here, where I was before and shouldn't have scrolled the page, from the base of a word called tikto, a bow, and here's where the problem comes, apparently as the simplest fabric. Where does that come from? I couldn't find any source, any justification for that meaning. Now let's go see this word tikto. Let's see, it says it's a verb, and it says to bear, to bring forth, to produce. That has nothing to do with cloths either. Look at, this is how, how Strong's is keyed to the King James. This one gives NASB translation is to beget or bring forth. Other words, to bear birth, born, brings forth, gave birth, blah, blah, blah. So, and then it gives its use in classical literature. Homer, to bring forth, bear fruit, produce. What does that have to do with a weapon of war? Well, here's the connection. The bow originally meant not just the arched piece of wood, the bow itself, but the arrow that it shot. In other words, a bow, or this tikto, meant something that was shot out of something else. And do you see the connection to birth? Baby comes out of the mother. Something is propelling something else. Okay? That's where we get, that's what the base word of toxon is, this tikto, and it has to do with propelling something out of something else. Okay? Here again, nothing to do with a simple piece of cloth, and certainly nothing to do with a metaphorical use of such an idea, being a bow or rainbow, or something surrounding the person, an article of clothing or aura or whatever you want to call it. So in doing this research, I find no justification for Strong saying that it was the simplest cloth. That's just something they seem to have pulled from thin air. And if you don't know this, you're going to go to that verse in Revelation and go, oh, well, this is the false, rainbow, as opposed to God's true rainbow, and this denotes such and such. And no, that's all based upon a misunderstanding, which is based upon a contrived, arbitrary meaning that Strong's Concordance pulled out of the air. So if you know these things, then it changes what conclusions you can draw on it. So that's why this is important, and I hear people all the time coming up with some pretty wild ideas about what the Bible's teaching here when it has absolutely no basis in fact. Unfortunately, this sort of thing has not stopped, as in terms of the people who are in charge of these resources. That's where a lot of the problem lies. There's figuratively blood on their hands, on the hands of the people who did the vowel pointing, the people who changed deliberately to words that were specific about the Messiah to something more ambiguous, and to the Strong's Concordance. There is a group of people called United Bible Societies, and they have been in charge for generations of trying to determine what is the authoritative original language text, whether it's Hebrew or Greek. And so they're in charge of making the dictionaries and lexicons, basically, and deciding what the semantic range, the range of meanings of any particular word is. But here we have, and go back again, it times itself out after 60 seconds and goes to a place where they never bothered to develop the site. Here, take a note of this. I'll try to put this in the description. You've got 1 minute to read. What I do is I downloaded the page, I saved it. I should have put that up instead of the live link here, and took out the JavaScript so it wouldn't redirect. This is an entire index of someone named Junia in the New Testament, Romans 16:7. And the argument is over whether Junia was male or female. Now, Junia is a female name, but the people on the committee, the United Bible Society's committee, couldn't endure the thought of a female apostle, because this Junia is called an apostle, and an outstanding one in that context. And since then there have been other attempts, since this has been blown out of the water as fake, and I'll just give you that right now. On this page there's a section called, stop that. No, that's not what it's called. It's called From a Review of Epp's Book. Gordon Epp, I think is his name. I might have that wrong. Anyway, somewhere along here, I think it was part 1. Yeah. Part 1. Let me scroll down here. From a Review of Epp's Book. That link is dead now, too. This is a very old article. Shows that the earlier editions of the UBS, the United Bible Societies, actually gave the unattested name Junius an A rating, claiming majuscule support for that ruling when majuscules are unaccented. Let me translate that for you. Unattested means they got nothing to go on. They just made it up. A rating means they're absolutely certain that this is what it means. Majuscule means capital letters. The original Greek of the New Testament was what you would call the mother of all wall of text. It was all capitals, no spaces, no punctuation, nothing. It's just a giant wall of text in capitals. Okay, those are majuscules. Claiming majuscule support for a ruling when majuscules are unaccented, they were basing their decision that Junio must have been a man on the basis of an accent. Stop that. On the basis of an accent that didn't even exist in the original text. So there's that sophistry we heard about earlier. Still going on. Bruce Metzger is a very well-known, well-respected Greek scholar, but he had his prejudices too. By his own admission, in his commentary, the committee made their ruling based on the gender assumptions imposed by some members of the committee. And he gives the source for that, textual commentary, page 475, by Bruce Metzger. Also notable is the persistence of lexicons and other reference works in locating the name under the nominative masculine. Nominative just means, it's the subject of the sentence. Masculine is the grammatical gender. An indictment is made. In broad terms, it is fair to say that to a large extent our modern lexica, dictionaries, grammars, and many commentaries, especially during the past century, have carried forward, indeed have aided and abetted, the tradition of Junius masculine. So, of course, it had predictable results. I mean, for all that time, 100 years, translations were being made on the basis of a lie, in order to take away any example in the Bible of a woman with authority, spiritual authority. In brief, it says down here, the early church fathers considered Junia, which people get hung up on. There's no J's in the... Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about with languages. This is Junia. This is how we pronounce it in English. No, they didn't have J's, but that's how we pronounce it. They would have pronounced it Unia, a female apostle. Later commentaries suggested that the name was Unias, a male and an apostle. Recently, there has been a consensus that the name is Unia, female. Now the discussion centers around whether she was among the apostles rather than known to the apostles. This is a very recent attempt in the last few years at reading the Greek grammatical construction in a new way. So yeah, it still goes on. If you get the gist of it, it is that the people on the committee saw a female apostle and says, no, we can't have this, so they changed the Bible and violated their own rules. They're not supposed to make changes without getting evidence from antiquity that this name in fact was used, that it was a male or female name. They had none of that, and they let it stand for 100 years, at least 50, and quietly changed it back, again, breaking their own rules. No attestation, no explanation, no notes, they just changed it quietly. And many English translations still, even though they will say the feminine name Junia, they will put a footnote on it and say, or Junius, masculine. If you can't see what's wrong with that, then this discussion is over, because this is not the first instance. It probably won't be the last. And the problem here is that this is a big deal because we're dealing with original language documents from which all translations stem. And that's a big deal. So that's just a beginning, just touching the surface of the issues with the Bible text. Now again, as I said at the beginning, this does not mean that the Bible is unreliable. I think if you did this kind of study with other ancient documents, you would find a lot more problems. Now, when it comes to motivation for changing the Bible, I think you should be able to figure out by now that the people most likely to monkey with it are the ones most entrusted with its care. Because who else would care what it says? I mean, I don't go around trying to change the Quran or the Vedas or anything like that because I think they're false, so I don't care what they say. I don't care how accurate they are. Why would I want to change them? But when it comes to the Bible, so the people most likely to change them are going to be the people who are least suspected of doing so, because, why would these good people who are so smart and well trained have any reason to change it? Well, we already know how people are. They want their prejudices and personal pet peeves put into the authoritative word of God. In other words, they're putting words in God's mouth, and that's a serious problem for which they will have to answer. But the point, once again, is that these things are never done perfectly. These secrets come out because they make mistakes, and we can find those mistakes. And the fact that we can find them, the fact that I said all these things and was able to track down the source material, proves that we can find the truth by any rational standard. I mean, if you don't trust anything beyond your eyes, none of this will matter. But this is all consistent with, and this is again a matter of probability, that the best you can do. Nobody can prove anything 100%, but when it comes to probability, I think it's pretty high that not only has the Bible been changed, and these changes affect how people interpret the Bible, but we can find the truth if we really dig for it. So I'm going to put some basic outline and links and things in the description, and hope you find it helpful. And any minute now, I'm going to find the stop button on this recording. See you next time.